Hello to everybody coming into us from the vast expanse of interstellar space. We welcome you here among us. So my name is Lee Kern, and I'm one of the priests here at St. James Cathedral. And we're so excited that you're all here with us tonight for this important lecture, and it couldn't be more timely, eh? So we put on Christian education series that are open to the public, free to all, and we start with worship at 6 and then a meal at 6:30 together, and then our lecture here at approximately 7. I'm sure people were waiting on the live stream down to the second, and they know I'm a little bit late, so I'm sorry about that. And one of our important series that we do every single month, every month we have a Truth and Reconciliation lecture. And this is in response to the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in Canada that calls upon the churches to offer free educational opportunities for Canadians to learn about colonialism and the legacy of residential schools. So that's what lecture series that I invite you to. And our next event for that series is this coming Tuesday, November 14th. And so we'll begin like we did before with worship and then a meal and then gathering here. And Bishop Mark MacDonald is joining us, and he's talking about what is reconciliation. How do we live as people of reconciliation and forgiveness and healing in our interpersonal lives, with one another, with the land, with broader society, and of course between settlers and Indigenous peoples. What is reconciliation, and what does our faith teach us about reconciliation? So that's Tuesday, November 14th, 7 o'clock here with Bishop Mark MacDonald. I commend it to all of you. Invite your friends. He's a fabulous speaker, our national Indigenous bishop, and he is also North America's representative to the World Council of Churches, and he's really quite an impressive person, so it'll be a joy to have him. Now, about our talk here tonight. We are here to think, pray, and talk amongst each other and at our tables, and the conversation spills over into our lives about this crisis that we find ourselves in now with nuclear warfare and nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons, seemingly a bygone problem of the Cold War, have raged back into our daily headlines. From North Korea to Iran to the decay of U.S. Russian relations, the threat of nuclear conflict feels more pressing than it has in decades. Fears are exacerbated by the heated rhetoric coming currently from the White House, where President Trump holds the unilateral power to destroy life on Earth with one single order. What is a Christian or a person in general to think, feel, and do in our anxious age? This talk here tonight with Reverend Tyler Wigg-Stevenson will supply a brief premiere on the history and current state of nuclear weapons, as well as an overview of Christian theological and political engagement with nuclear weapons, deterrence, and disarmament, and will conclude with the possible next steps for action and advocacy in the Canadian church context. Now, before we begin, I'd like us to take a moment of silence and a moment of prayer here together. God of peace, God who is our peacemaker, make peace in our hearts, peace between us and one another, and all creation. In gratitude, God, we acknowledge this traditional land of your Indigenous peoples here, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Mississaugas of New Credit. And we acknowledge the responsibility of this land and the responsibility to live as people of peace, truth, and reconciliation with all our relations here on this beautiful land in the shores of Niigani-Gichigami, Lake Ontario. Show us the way of peace. Show to us the path of truth and life, and help us to walk there in it. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you. Now it's my delight to introduce to you my friend and colleague, the Reverend Tyler Wigg-Stevenson. He is the assistant pastor just down the street, and I know some of you go there too, at Little Trinity Anglican Church, and he's the author of several books, including multiple award-winning The World Is Not Ours to Save, Prior to entering full-time congregational ministry, Tyler worked for many years as a faith-based advocate for the abolition of nuclear weapons, principally as the founder of the U.S.-based Two Futures Project. Tyler continues to serve as chair of the Global Task Force on Nuclear Weapons for the World Evangelical Alliance, an international network of 600 million Christians, and sits on the board of the Plowshares Fund, a leading nuclear security funding organization. Tyler has spoken about faith and nuclear weapons at venues as varied as the United Nations, Washington National Cathedral, and Willow Creek Church, as well as in numerous interviews with both secular and religious media. Currently a doctoral student in interdisciplinary theology at the University of Toronto, Tyler has written extensively on issues of faith and culture, both in peer-reviewed journals and popular publications like The Washington Post, Christianity Today, CNN.com, and Sojourners. Tyler and his wife, Natalie, a professor and theologian, live in Toronto with their 2 young daughters. And it's my joy to welcome here today.
Good evening. I want to extend my sincere thanks to the Cathedral for having me this evening, for extending this invitation, in particular to Lee for giving me this invitation, and also wanted to thank my friend Tay, the Reverend Tay Moss, whose volunteer hard work is allowing this to be live streamed. His technical expertise is extraordinary, and I'm grateful for his generous gift of it. Tonight is personally exciting for me because, as you'll have gathered from the introduction, I spent much of my early career in professional anti-nuclear work. And this is the first time that I have ever been able or had the opportunity to bridge these 2 vocational halves of my life. The one, the anti-nuclear work, which I've been doing since I graduated from college, and has occupied the better part of the last 18 years for me. And then this priestly and pastoral ministry, which for me started as a Baptist minister in 2006. I never wound up serving a church. I wound up in this faith-based advocacy role instead, and then finally wound up here in Toronto, where I've had the great privilege of serving as a pastor to the people at Little Trinity Church. And so for me, this is exciting, the chance to bring 2 parts of my life together that I haven't been able to do before. I want to thank you all for coming tonight. I'm a little bemused, actually, because for the better part of my working on this issue, getting people out on a Wednesday night to hear about nuclear weapons was something that you had to do with a crowbar. And so to see people voluntarily turning out in numbers to think about nuclear weapons is somewhat gratifying to me, but also somewhat saddening, because I'm sorry for the ambient anxiety that I think so obviously contributes to people's interest in this topic. So I am grateful for you being here, and I hope it'll be worth your time. And I also just want to thank the members of my parish who are out in force, and it's lovely to see you all. So I'll see you all on Sunday. I'll see you all on Sunday. 2 final caveats. I'm not a technical expert in nuclear weapons. I've spent my entire career in political advocacy and in scholarly and popular theology and ethics on the issue. So I'm not going to dwell on a lot of the technical components of nuclear weapons. I've been in the issue a long time, though, so if you have questions on that, I may be able to answer them in the Q&A period. If I can, I will. If I can't, I'll tell you that. The other is, you might be able to tell I have a cold. I've been studiously not talking to anybody all day, being very rude to everyone I could find, but I'm hoping my vocal cords give out. I thank you for your patience. Finally, I just wanted to say I'm coming to this with 2 sets of dual identities. One is as a Canadian permanent resident and as an American citizen. So I vote. I don't live where I vote, and I don't vote where I live. And for me, it's a bit of This is going to be a bit of a cross-border talk in some sense, because my expertise and knowledge base is really the U.S. situation, but I am doing my best as a Canadian permanent resident, as the now father of 2 Canadian daughters, so I'm contributing, 1/10 millionth to the population boom in Canada, to do my best to be responsible to my context as well. So I'll be navigating that as we go. The other dual identity, as you'll have gathered from the introduction, is that I'm an Anglican evangelical. And does everybody know what a mullet is, like in terms of the hairstyle, right? So the mullet, as hairstyles go, is what Anglican evangelicals are to the church. It's sort of business in the front and then party in the back. And that's kind of how this talk is going to go, I hope. So I'm going to start very respectably as an Anglican with you all, but by the end I might wind up being an evangelical, and I hope you'll bear with me. The outline of what we're going to talk about tonight is there on the screen in front of you. 3 simple parts which we'll just kind of dive into. 1, what is happening? How we've arrived at our present anxiety and the crisis that it produces. 2, what to think. Not telling you what to think, but what a distinctively Christian perspective might mean for considering nuclear weapons. And 3rd, what to do, what a distinctively Christian witness would look like in action. And before I continue, can everybody hear me okay? I can hear myself just fine, but I'm self-conscious about my voice. All right. So what is happening? Let's see. I have my first slide here. Yeah. What is happening? A crisis of memory. I think we are engaged in a crisis of memory and remembering nuclear weapons at our present point in history. The fact is that the people who remember nuclear weapons being used are dying. They're getting old and they are dying. I've been to Hiroshima and Nagasaki 3 times, and increasingly the testimonials that you hear when you go are from adolescents at best and getting down to children. And pretty soon when you go to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there won't be anybody who lived through it who will be able to talk to you. And in that absence of lived memory, I think we're seeing similar other phenomena spring up. The renaissance of neo-Nazism and anti-Semitism is, I think, directly correlates to the fact that the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust are fading from lived memory. And so these horrors that lack a lived reality for people have started to become concepts that a new generation feels the liberty to kind of play around with. And I think we're seeing that with nuclear weapons as well. There's little sense among younger people exactly what these things do. Their grandparents maybe aren't around to tell them about them. So I think we are at a crisis point in the true sense of that word, danger and opportunity mixed. As many of you probably know, Donald Trump is traveling through Asia right now, President Trump, and I wonder, quite honestly, without a hint of scaremongering, whether historians will look back at this trip as dating the start of the Second Korean War. I have to say that I've been working on nuclear disarmament for 18 years. I have never expected the use of nuclear weapons as much as I do right now. I don't expect that they will be used as opposed to not be used, but if they are, I can't say that I will be surprised in this present moment. And I've never felt like that before, not in my entire adult career of working on this. The same crisis of memory, though, also presents some possibility to us, because they're not so sacrosanct anymore. They're not, the weapons that won the Great War, our grandparents' war. And so that offers a groundbreaking possibility for their elimination. And so the 2 pictures that are in the background here of this slide are Kim Jong-un watching a missile launch, and then the crew of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons celebrating their recent Nobel Prize win on the day that they found out. So I think it remains to be seen which way we're going to go, but the days of we must have them so that we don't use them are over. I think we either won't have them or we will use them. The macro sense of how we got here, of course, begins with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the United States dropped 2 atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and August 9th, respectively, 1945. Those bombings resulted in over 200,000 dead, and the war wrapped up shortly thereafter.
I think there's a mythology that they won the war. It's a mythology that I disagree with. I'd be happy to have that out in the Q&A period if you're interested. But nevertheless, regardless of historical causality, certainly there's that appearance, there's that sensibility, and I think that largely contributes to why we think of nuclear weapons as differently than we do about chemical or biological weapons. One won the war in the Pacific, the other two are the despicable arms of the Axis. There was subsequent proliferation. The USSR, the UK, France, and China. Over the next couple decades, there would be hundreds upon hundreds of atmospheric nuclear tests, which caused untold devastation, mostly to indigenous and rural populations in the countries that tested them. By the 1960s, and I'm going somewhere with this, by the 1960s, when China acquired nuclear weapons, there started to develop a concern that a world with dozens of nuclear-armed states would be troublesome. And so the countries got together and formed a treaty called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has been in force since 1970, and it is the cornerstone of the global non-proliferation regime. It is arguably creditable with why we don't have a world with dozens or scores of nuclear-armed states. The central premise of the NPT, as I'll be calling it from now on, the central premise of the NPT was a grand bargain between the countries that at that point had nuclear weapons, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and everybody else. The nuclear haves agreed to pursue negotiations to the elimination of their own arsenals, and the nuclear have-nots agreed not to acquire nuclear weapons in the meanwhile. And everybody got access to nuclear power. That's the basic gist of the NPT. Now, granted, action on those disarmament movements did not start immediately in 1970. In fact, arsenals kept on ramping up. So let's see, I'm going to skip ahead to this slide here. So you can see, this is just for background, you can kind of see the global stockpile of nuclear weapons, how it proceeded over the years. But you can certainly see that it doesn't stop going up at the time of the NPT. It actually starts to skyrocket. There's this massive increase in the Russian stockpile, or at that point the Soviet stockpile. However, there were 4 nations that didn't sign the NPT. They were India, Israel, Pakistan, and Cuba. They, I think, rightly and presciently said we are not going to consign ourselves to being second-hand states, and second-class states will be those that don't have nuclear weapons. They all subsequently developed their own nuclear weapons, except for Cuba, which has signed and joined the treaty. But the Democratic Republic of Korea, better known as North Korea, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, better known as North Korea, dropped out of the treaty in 2003 and has developed their own nuclear weapons. So there are 4 nuclear weapons, 4 states that aren't party to the treaty, that aren't subject to its discipline, who have developed their own nuclear weapons. At the end of the Cold War, there was a terrific optimism, I think, that nuclear weapons were going to be a thing of the past, and a lot of the impetus for disarmament vanished from popular movements at that time. Some of you may have been part of the movements in the 80s or the 70s. And you would have seen the change in attitude that happened in the 90s, which from today's perspective look so remarkably carefree. The NPT was renewed indefinitely. It was originally a 25-year treaty. In 1995, the states parties got together and said, we think this is indefinitely good. We want to stay part of it. By the 2000s, there started to develop a global impatience, however, what I would describe as a global impatience, especially confronted with the international community's dissatisfaction with the George W. Bush administration and their nuclear posture. What had seemed like a temporary holding pattern in the NPT started to seem like a permanent discriminatory norm to a number of nations in the world. And they started to see it as a permanent situation of nuclear haves and nuclear have-nots. And it was arguably this situation that leads to North Korea pursuing their own nuclear program, as I said, in 2003. In 2008, and this is a galloping tour of nuclear history, but please bear with me. In 2008, of course, Barack Obama is elected President of the United States, and in 2009, the Palm Sunday of his first year in office, he gives a now famous speech in Prague, which says the United States seeks the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons, though possibly not in his lifetime. And it's arguably for this speech alone that he won the Nobel Peace Prize that year. And his administration had some successes in this goal. They negotiated a New START treaty with Russia, a new strategic arms reduction treaty with Russia, which was middling in terms of its numbers, but it kept the numbers going down and kept inspection mechanisms back and forth. Toward the end of the second term, they negotiated a deal with Iran, which had every right to nuclear power, but the problem is that nuclear power and nuclear weapons use the same technologies. And so depending on how states act, if you're developing nuclear power, it looks suspicious. It looks like you might be trying to create a nuclear weapons capacity. A lot of mistrust toward Iran leads to this landmark deal late in the Obama second term. But I would say arguably the Prague agenda was a disappointment, especially to those of us in the nuclear abolitionist sector who saw a great deal of rhetoric on the topic, but did not see a corresponding action. In fact, saw the nuclear status quo, the nuclear bureaucracy just completely undoing and ignoring the commander-in-chief's rather high-flown rhetoric. About the same time, in 2010, now here's the parallel strand, there is a shift, there's the development of what's called the Humanitarian Impact of Nuclear Weapons, HINW. This is a focus of discourse around what the weapons do. So nuclear weapons conferences are always about how to keep them secure and who's going to use them when and how to keep them safe and that sort of thing. And this was an effort that just sort of said, we're not going to do that. We're not going to involve the security experts. It was largely convened by the International Federation of the Red Cross, which with the government of Norway convened a series of conferences that just asked, what do nuclear weapons do? What's the humanitarian consequence of these things? And they had 3 conferences in Norway, Mexico, and Austria, which were boycotted by the nuclear weapons states, which saw these developments as pretty dangerous. And those subsequently turned into the negotiations for a ban on nuclear weapons, a universal ban on nuclear weapons. Similar has been done with landmines, chemical weapons, biological weapons. And that ban treaty was successfully negotiated at the United Nations and achieved on July 17th of this past year. It was a really remarkable history-turning accomplishment. It currently has 53 signatories. It has 3 ratifications. It hasn't been open for signatory or ratification very long. And once it achieves 50 ratifications, it'll enter into force. And that treaty is notable for focusing on the effect of nuclear weapons, especially in their testing, on women and children and indigenous communities, which have borne a disproportionate brunt of the consequence of nuclear testing. I think it's extraordinary because it deals with the cycles of reproduction and the way in which they are simply attacked by nuclear weapons and radiation. And I'm going to see how this works. So a couple weeks ago, I was in Washington at a dinner for the Plowshares Fund, on whose board I sit, and I had the privilege of sitting across the table from Beatrice Finn, who is the executive director of the organization that just won the Nobel Peace Prize. And I said, hey, I'm giving a talk in Toronto in a couple weeks. What would you like to say to everybody there? And so she said this.
Get angry and do something.
Could you hear that? She said, my phone was all the way down.
Get angry and do something.
So there's the message of the Nobel Prize winner to you all, delivered personally. She said, get angry and do something, which is not far off from where I'm going to wind up. Turning to the current situation, which is what's on most of our minds. Joe Cirancione, the president of the Plowshares Fund, who I greatly admire, has said the greatest nuclear threat right now lives in the White House. And I think there's some legitimacy to that. This is not to take away any of the blame that rightly falls on the Russian Federation, that rightly falls on North Korea. But I think what's on most people's mind is President Trump. And the 3 presenting crises are North Korea and the Iran deal and the budget. And North Korea, I think, has vaulted to the front of the pack. The crisis with North Korea, basically, is that they are testing increasingly powerful nuclear weapons and increasingly long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles. And what this means is that they are looking for the capacity, at least, to threaten cities on the United States mainland. North Korea has said quite overtly, quite self-consciously, that they see themselves as wanting to be the exception to Libya and Iraq, two countries that gave up their programs for weapons of mass destruction and subsequently had their regimes overthrown by outside powers. They don't want that to happen to themselves, which, without giving any illusions about North Korea's virtue, it is, I think, defies superlatives, the human rights abuse and wickedness that goes on in that place. From a purely sort of rational perspective, you can see where they're coming from. They seem committed to a course of strategic parity with the United States before they talk, and the United States seems committed to stopping that. So there's no openness to dialogue, and that's been exacerbated by what I think is needless rhetoric that really feels more apt for the playground than the international stage. With President Trump saying he's going to bring fire and fury like the world has never seen. He's going to totally destroy North Korea. Secretary of State Tillerson said we'll continue diplomacy until the first bomb drops. And President Trump evidently told Senator Lindsey Graham, that if thousands die, they're going to die over there, not over here. So the U.S. is prepared to be moving by force to destroy North Korea's strategic capacity. But let's be clear. If the U.S. destroys a missile on the launch pad, that is war with North Korea. And the problem with North Korea is that they've got massive artillery and massive infantry about 30 miles from a city of 25 million people. So they could kill hundreds of thousands of people without ever launching a nuclear weapon. And it's basically impossible to remove that capacity in a military way. So there's a situation without a military solution that's careening toward a military conflagration. Estimations of the casualties of the first day of open conflict on the Korean Peninsula range from 300,000 to 1 million if it goes nuclear. If there were the retaliation on Seoul and Tokyo, which is entirely expected, then the dead could number well over 2 million in a day. A friend of mine who's deeply knowledgeable about North Korea, who knows a number of people in that country, has said that they will absolutely take down the region with them if they feel that the regime is under attack. There are 230,000 U.S. citizens in Korea, which include 28,000 U.S. troops, many, many more in Japan, which is also under threat. And I just ask you as a thought experiment to think about what the United States' reaction was to 3,000 dead in the suicide bombings of 9/11, and what the response would be if 100,000 U.S. citizens were killed in a day. There's an effort to push back. In Congress, there is a bill in the House and the Senate to bar the president's ability to order a unilateral first nuclear strike. There's another resolution barring a U.S. attack on North Korea altogether without congressional approval. My personal conviction, opinion, I'm not a mind reader, I haven't read any secret documents, but my personal conviction is that we are in a situation remarkably similar to that leading up to Iraq, that there are elements within the administration that want a war, not because they like death and destruction, but because out of their concern for I'm putting myself in a different mindset than the one I tend to occupy, but because they believe that North Korea cannot be allowed to be the counterexample to Iraq and to Iraq and Libya, that it shouldn't matter, that if you acquire that weapons of mass destruction or no, you are not safe from the punitive consequences leveled by the United States. And so all the rhetoric to me sounds to me like an administration that's trying to create the illusion of going through a process but which already knows what it wants. Last night, when you're in Asia, the two are confused. President Trump gave a speech to the South Korean Assembly, which establishes a precondition for talks with North Korea, denuclearization, and the end of their missile program, which is the highest hanging fruit that would be at the end of negotiations with them. And he said it's the preconditions for sitting down to talk, which is sort of like saying, I'm really interested in interfaith dialogue with you, you just have to convert to Christianity first. So I think that this is rhetoric that is designed to look open while shutting a door. I hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong. I don't have any cheerful conclusion to that. I wake up every morning checking the news to see what I fear the most. The Iran deal is not even a footnote. It's another crisis in the making, but it's like reading Kafka. There is no reason to eliminate this deal, yet the president on the campaign said it was the worst deal in history, which is remarkable news for the Russians, given that we bought Alaska for them for like $10. It's the worst deal in history, and so he couldn't bring himself to do the 90-day certification that it was in the national interest. And so he decertified it and kicked it back to Congress. And if Congress imposes sanctions, it amounts to a unilateral renegotiation of that deal. Iran will pull out, they will have the moral high ground, and there will be absolutely no supervision over their nuclear capacities whatsoever. It is, again, an easy way to go to war if you want it. Add to that, there is the backdrop of a nuclear modernization plan that President Obama agreed to as the price of getting the New START treaty. He agreed to spend $1 trillion over 30 years modernizing America's nuclear weapons. The actual price tag has now come out at 1.2 to 1.5 trillion over 30 years. And when you're spending that kind of money on something over 3 decades, you're not really in a position to get rid of it. So the summary is, it's not good. The summary is, it's not good. And we are in this crisis, I think, of memory of which way are we going to go with these things. Here's just some quick facts. I should have cycled through this, but I didn't want to belabor the details. As you can see, the U.S. and Russia still possess 93% of all nuclear warheads. Everyone else is in the hundreds region. There are a set of countries that maintain high alert nuclear weapons, which mean they could be launched within 5 minutes or so. That's certainly true of the United States. So what to think? How to react to this as Christians? I think the question is, what's the distinctly Christian response here? What's the particularly Christian response here? I mean, look at me. We're standing in the shadow of a cathedral. I'm wearing this. So what's the distinctly Christian response to this situation? Well, we have to acknowledge that some Christians are pushing for war, and some non-Christians are urging peace. So there's nothing particularly Christian about not wanting a nuclear war. You don't need a personal relationship with Jesus not to want to be blown up. And I think the first step, therefore, for me, is humility, just recognizing that Christians don't have a lock on moral reasoning. But within that, there is, I think, a place for a distinctly Christian response, and here's my contention, that if Christian activism is to be Christian, it must be a witness and a testimony to the Lord we serve. Which is to say, our activism must, in its motivation, method, and substance, reflect the revelation of God and Jesus Christ and proclaim the gospel, that he died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that in his blood shed on the cross, God is pleased to make peace with all things in heaven and on earth, that those who trust in the faith and righteousness of the sacrifice of Christ are entrusted with that same peacemaking vocation that they have been the beneficiaries of, and become peace emissaries to the world, offering God's extended offer of peace through them and offering peace with one another. So if that's the case, what's the Christian response to nuclear weapons and the anxiety of our age? I want to go through 3 levels of it. And I think it goes deeper and deeper and deeper. The first level of Christian engagement, and this is more historical, is about when and whether and how it's okay to use nuclear weapons. And this is the just war tradition, which I am sympathetic to in many respects. The just war tradition, described in the words of John Howard Yoder, a theologian who was one of its most incisive critics, was to say that in particular cases there are actions that inflict harm in a responsibly structured way are morally preferable to letting some adversary inflict some other harm, which one can argue would be greater. That is, in some cases, it is more loving to go to war than to suffer it. You can agree with that or not, but it has been the ethical framework that has governed Christian thinking about armed conflict in some manner for the better part of the last 1,500 years. It applies to nuclear weapons. Just war is known principally for its set of criteria: when it's okay to go to war, and if you're in war, how you can wage war. And nuclear weapons are principally related to two of the criteria of how you wage war. So just war depends on being able to discriminate between combatant and non-combatant. That's a core criterion of it, as well as proportionality, that the damage done must be proportional to the conflict at hand. And so when we think of those things which nuclear weapons are unable to do, the question that arises, I think, is what distinguishes nuclear weapon from, say, the fire bombings of Tokyo or Dresden or Coventry that happened in World War II? What distinguishes them from the use of conventional weapons, which is not discriminatory, which is not proportional? More people died in the firebombing of Tokyo than either of the atomic bombings. It was much more lethal. So why is it different? Why do we talk about nuclear weapons as if they were a sui generis category in the just war theory? And what I would present to you is that nuclear weapons represent the weaponization of a tactic that is categorically forbidden in the just war tradition. So there is a way of being indiscriminate, there is a way of being non-proportional, and what nuclear weapons do is they take that out of the realm of human decision making and they weaponize that tactic in the bomb itself. Now, it's possible to imagine cases in which nuclear weapons would be detonated and be discriminatory and proportional, that wouldn't violate just war, but they mostly involve Bruce Willis. And none of them are plausible in real life. That's the thing. It's like you will get these military planners who will give you these sort of far-fetched scenarios of, there's an army in the middle of the Gobi Desert and we put a small nuclear weapon on them. And you sort of think to yourself, well, okay, yes, I suppose you could come up with a hypothetical situation that's going to satisfy ticking the boxes here, but in real life, what we know is that people act irrationally and people act with emotion, and nuclear weapons are going to violate these categories. The other aspect of nuclear weapons is that there's this taboo. They haven't been used in 72 years and counting. It's a meaningful taboo, and breaking the taboo will make them more usable. There is simply no way to align nuclear weapons with the criteria of what's called macro proportionality, of saying it has to do more good than harm. There's this little verse in Deuteronomy that I love, Deuteronomy 20:19. It says, when the Israelites are making war, they can cut down trees to make siege engines to besiege a city, but they're not to cut down the fruit trees, because the fruit trees are for the benefit of humankind. And the principle I see enshrined here is that we are not to imagine that the conflicts of our day are the conflicts of future generations to come. So wage what wars you will, but don't take away the apples of your grandchildren. And that's precisely what nuclear weapons do. This categorical distinction means that so that's where I would sum up the just war tradition. But then as we take it a step deeper, because nuclear weapons offer this particular categorical distinction within the just war tradition, I also think they bear on questions of political theology. And I'm going to try and go through this quickly because it's a sort of arcane argument, but I thought it was worth presenting. The humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons discourse that I mentioned sought to shift the debate from how and when to use the nuclear weapons, the just war type questions, to what do the weapons do? And what they found was that any use of nuclear weapons would have far-reaching, catastrophic, perhaps irreversible consequences on humanitarian effects, ranging from the health consequences of fallout to systemic environmental collapse to an exchange of 100 nuclear weapons could cause a global famine, killing 1 billion people, to a more extensive could eliminate the ozone layer, and then you've got the worst case, which would literally kill all human beings. The findings of the humanitarian conferences said the risk to the existence of nuclear weapons are underestimated and unacceptable. Said the consequences of nuclear use mean it would contravene international health and humanitarian law. and that consideration of these humanitarian impacts raises profound ethical and moral questions, and I'd add a theological one as well. So here's the gist of the argument. States, countries, do what we don't allow people to do in general, in that they take money and they kill people. And when they do, we don't always call it robbery and murder. We think that there are ways that there may be some of us who think that any action of killing is murder, but I would imagine that most of us live in a world where we can think that some state action, in the terms of a judicious police force, is not murder. Likewise, taxation is not robbery per se. The reason that we don't call these things robbery and murder are because states pair force with authority. This is, and the great church father Augustine said that the authority of the state derived entirely to the degree that it served justice for its people. This is what differentiates a state from a band of robbers. So that's one premise, and I think it's one that we that is biblically grounded from a Christian standpoint. That, as Romans 13 would articulate, the maintenance of social order is a divine command, and it is grounded in the ability to provide justice for a people. Fast forward to the great scholastic theologian Thomas Aquinas, who added to the political theology of Augustine in many ways by saying that if a ruler does not act legitimately, if they exceed their authority, or if they contravene its purpose, then they become a tyrant, and they are illegitimate, and they should not be obeyed. So when you pair these two together, what you have is the contention, a Christian theological contention, that a state that is not acting justly forfeits its right, its authority, to claim a mandate for taking money or killing. That if it is not acting with justice, it is in fact acting simply as a robber or as a murderer with rank. And that all that it might do, though it pretends it has the right to do it as a state, is a facade, it's a scam. And that in that case, when a state is acting without justice, the moral culpability that a state, the mantle of state authority and state justice usually, the moral immunity that usually gives to its officers disappears. And we have a contemporary example, or a living memory example of this with the court of Nuremberg, that said there's no state authority that ever could have ordered those concentration camps. You had no right. It was beyond your capacity because they defied justice. And because they defied justice, no mantle of state authority can protect the people who initiated the actions, and so the moral culpability devolves to the individual rather than to being spread to the state. Where am I going with this? A state that causes harm to its own people opposes the purpose of its authority and justice. And a state that inhibits the ability of another state to serve its own people exceeds its competency. And what that means is if you take the humanitarian findings seriously, and if they are accurate, and I think they are, then you say that nuclear weapons present an unjust set of risks and harms that cannot be bound to the service of justice. And if that is true, then it means that a state using or threatening or relying on nuclear weapons has compromised its state constituting authority and is ordering something that it actually has no right to order as the entity that it is. It means that states can't actually use nuclear weapons, which is a hard thing to wrap your mind around because who else is going to use nuclear weapons except the terrorists? 5 years ago, that would have been this entire presentation, but that's a whole different kettle of radioactive fish. So states can't actually use nuclear weapons as states any more than they can build concentration camps as states and say this is a legitimate program of our authority. And if nuclear weapons violate justice in this way, then we should maybe start looking at them like concentration camps with jet boosters and rocket wings, which are not protected by the mantle of state authority. And I would call us to account for the degree to which we have grown so comfortable and familiar with them, like the little boy who walks past the camp day after day, so long that ivy grows on its walls, so long that it seems venerable, justifiable, yet at the heart there is an absence of justice that cannot be justified. And no matter how familiar it has become, because, oh, we have these things, but they are not like those things. They are not like those camps. In fact, they are. They are devoid of justice. And what that means is that all our pretensions to using them are a sham. They're murder with government headlines. The radical implications of this, cribbing from Aquinas, is that commands from rulers regarding unjust things are by definition unlawful. And what I think this means is that you shouldn't be able to trust a Christian nuclear officer. And yet, there is still a deeper theological layer yet to the Christian witness on nuclear weapons, which goes beyond even what they do to the bodies they do it to. I've been in church leadership a long time, but my priestly ministry in this diocese has brought home to me the essentially embodied nature of the pastorate and the Christian life. This is not something that can be digitized or done at a distance. You do ministry with people you can touch and smell. We minister to bodies of dust that are quickened by the Holy Spirit, and bodies, ministry will teach you, are not cheap. Bodies are precious things. So when I hear that 1 million people could be lost on the first day of nuclear conflict on the Korean Peninsula, I think that number is a lie. Because that's an easy number to write and it's an easy number to erase. That's a duplicitous number. I'll tell you a truer number. A truer number is 40 million. Not people. The number of weeks that those people would have spent invisible to the world and known to their God as he knit them together in their mother's womb. Before ever they drew their first breath, before ever they were called by name. If you kill 1 million people, you are taking 40 million weeks from the earth. 40 million weeks is 769,230 years. That's 192,000 times the length of recorded human history. That's what we're talking about when you talk about 1 million dead. You're talking about bodies preciously formed by God, erased. My last visit to Nagasaki, I was in the Peace Memorial Museum there. It's the moment in the trip that always breaks me. I know the emotional rhythms of it by now. I saw a new picture there that time. It was of the corpse of a mother and a little boy who was maybe 1 to 2 years old by his size. He looked about the same size as my youngest. And they were laying by the train station in Nagasaki. And he was horribly burned. His head was like a charcoal briquette down to his chin. But what made the picture really horrible was the fact that his mother must have been carrying him somehow. This is how atomic heat works. It comes like this. It doesn't hang around unless you're in a flammable structure. And so there were parts of his body that looked just fine. And the way she'd been holding him, only his head and his face down to his chin and his extremities were burned, and the rest of his skin was pale and clean. And he lay there on the ground like a log, and his shirt was pulled up. And I'm so tired of seeing pictures of kids with their shirts pulled up who are dead. Because that's always how they wind up. If they're washing up in the Mediterranean, if they're falling down in war, they always have these horribly exposed little stomachs. And this is what you learn as a parent. You pick your kids up, and their shirt's right up. You set them down, their shirt's right up. And they're so tender. And so you're always running around pulling down their shirts. Our imagery of nuclear weapons is always that mushroom cloud. but it's just the smoke of bodies. And it serves to keep us at a distance. Keep us at a distance from those bodies. The bodies that are in the smoke. I completely forgot my handkerchief. That's why it's a desecration. It's a desecration of the quotidian, I want to say. They defile the gift that is God's everyday gift for life. Because bodies are everyday things. Thank you. Thank you, Nancy. Bodies are everyday things. They need everyday reality. They're vulnerable. We need shelter. We need food. We need rest. We need company. We need warmth. I need a hot toddy, clearly. And nuclear weapons destroy bodies in a singular way that conventional weapons don't. That's why they're different. Because no matter how bad stuff gets, and it gets really bad. It gets really bad. Yemen is really bad right now. Syria is really bad right now. Vast swaths of Central Africa are really bad right now. But no matter how bad it gets, there's still room to repent. There's still room to treat each other the way God wanted. There's still room for bodies to exist as the Christian body. God makes his sun to shine and his rain to fall on the wicked and the righteous alike. But a nuclear weapon blots out that sun and it poisons the rain. They violate common grace, the common grace on which everything else depends. When I first started learning about this issue, I took a perverse delight in being strategically savvy and kind of understanding the ins and outs and being able to argue deterrence with the best of them and et cetera. And those skills are probably somewhere in a back pocket, but the longer I do this, the more I want to speak about the praise of naivete. Every conference I go to about nuclear weapons is about these strategic realities. And sometimes you'll get someone up there who will speak to core truths. They'll admit that they have grandkids. So it's usually a tack-on at the end. They know for our kids and grandkids, we have to do X, Y, and Z. These are American conferences. And then they always say, now I'm not naive, as if that were like the worst thing in the world. I'm not naive. I know these things aren't going to go away anytime soon. I know there's not much we can do. I know we need to maintain a few hundred. I'm not naive. So self-defeating. Why are people who care about peace so ready to apologize for the truth of our beliefs? These things are wicked. Now, invariably, these are people who have a job that depends on them being perceived as not idiots. And sometimes they're elected or they work for somebody elected. But my boss, and with all respect to Archbishop Colin Johnson, I'm not talking about him, my boss isn't up for re-election. So let me speak in praise of naivete. When the Lord sent out his disciples, this is where I turn into an evangelical. When the Lord sent out his disciples, he told them to be innocent as doves and wise as serpents. But the prince of this world is a snake. And so you get farther in life if you learn how to hiss instead of coo. Now our Lord told us to be bilingual in both. To be bilingual in snake and bilingual in dove. But I think I know which one's supposed to be our mother tongue. I think I know which language we're meant to dream in. So let me speak in praise of naivete. Because peace isn't a weak word. I mean, it's so often held up as if it is. You get such contempt if you care about peace. But peace isn't an absence of conflict, the simple absence of conflict. Dr. King taught us that. This evening, in evening prayer, we heard the passage from Isaiah, which has the famous image of plowshares being hammered into swords. The prophet Isaiah, paralleling the prophet Micah. What the Bible tells us is that plowshares don't fall out of the sky. There's human ingenuity and human effort. We do things. And we are going to do things that lead to life, or we are going to do things that lead to death. And the question is, which direction is our creativity going to go? Plowshares don't fall out of the sky. Swords don't become plowshares, and spears don't become pruning hooks without hammers, and without heat, and without backs that bend to the labor, and without hands that reach to the fire. So I don't want to hear anymore about peace being a weak word. I'm okay with hearing about fools for faith, who believe that the power of God is made perfect in weakness, and that the Lord does what the Lord does most perfectly as the Lord when he is wielding broken and bent vessels. So let me speak in praise of naivete. I think Canada needs faithful fools right now like that. I hope you'll let me say that as a newcomer. Canadian history has, of course, long styled this country as an advocate for peace, and that's a reputation that's based on fact. Lester B. Pearson, the only individual recipient from Canada of the Nobel Peace Prize, invented the UN peacekeeping forces. Canada played an instrumental role in the Ottawa Treaty banning landmines in 1997. There's a historic popular distaste for nuclear weapons here that's not the same as in the US. In 2010, the Harper government produced a parliamentary motion endorsing nuclear disarmament and supporting a nuclear weapons convention. And now we arrive at the current government. It's a commitment the current government pays lip service to. But in October 2017, which is last month, October 2017, during question period, it was asked of the government, when is the Canada going to sign the ban on nuclear weapons? We're against nuclear weapons, right? So when is Canada going to sign the ban against nuclear weapons? And the response from the government was, nuclear disarmament is certainly our goal, and we are taking measures to accede to the treaty. That's not true. It will not disarm a single weapon. It's true. Canada rallied 159 states to help pass a treaty to see a fissile material cutoff. Now, you have to be a nuclear wonk to be infuriated by that last bit, to claim credit that Canada is passing a treaty to see a fissile material cutoff. It did not. Never mind that the fissile material cutoff treaty is a pipe dream. I'm not even, well, we can talk about it in Q&A. Just be mad with me. It is a pipe dream. No on starting negotiations for the ban treaty last December. Canada boycotted the negotiations and unsurprisingly hasn't signed. And they declined to congratulate the Nobel laureates even after a Canadian, Hiroshima survivor Setsuko Thurlow, was announced as one of the people that will be receiving the prize in Oslo. When asked about the negotiations for the ban treaty, Trudeau called their efforts, quote, sort of useless. But sort of useless is a grown man who doesn't see the utility in naming right from wrong. What's sort of useless is a grown man who's happy to fly virtue's flag and smile at virtue's photo ops and parrot virtue's talking points without paying virtue's price. That's what's sort of useless. A good friend of mine, a university professor who teaches Canadian politics, said, Canada's foreign policy vision is always secondary to its economic relationship with the United States.
And I get that. I do. Canada doesn't have foreign policy interests to the same degree that the United States does. Canada's economic interest in the United States is disproportionately significant to the welfare of Canadians. It should be taken seriously. You've got NAFTA on the table. I understand why it's a reasonable concern. It's not pursuing filthy lucre. This is people's livelihoods. This is a reality that must be dealt with. And this is something that you could maybe do when you had the cover of the Obama administration as, look, well, we're engaging with the foreign policy of a government that wants to see the elimination of nuclear weapons, but now you have President Trump. And better than Donald Trump is not good enough. It is not a good enough standard for this Canadian government. The actions of my president pose a moral ultimatum to everybody who deals with them, which is how long and how deeply are you going to allow cooperation to degrade your ideals and demean what you believe in and defile your integrity? At what point do you start saying no? How many Canadian babies have to burn before the Canadian government cares about something beside the price of softwood? Let me speak in praise of naivete. There are the righteous of this nation. There are those who have faithfully labored for a very long time. Extended coalitions of organizations and people that I'm just now getting to know, who I'm honored to meet, who I'm honored are here tonight. Including those are faithful within the Anglican Church of Canada, who have produced decades of resolutions articulating the Church's opposition to nuclear weapons, who in 2007 had the foresight to join ICAN. The author of that motion to General Synod is sitting with us tonight. Thanks to her, if you're an Anglican, you won the Nobel Prize. It includes all 970 members of the Order of Canada who have called for a ban on nuclear weapons. But it's not enough. Canada needs to be called to its higher purposes, to live up to its principles. Canada and America need an uprising of prophets who are going to stand on Scripture and denounce wickedness and refuse to be moved and say, the word of the Lord endures in eternity, and it will not be shaken. And the prophet, we'll talk about the prophet Jonah, but in 1 second. In ancient Roman times, when a returning general came back victorious to the city, he would ride in procession through the city. And in his chariot, there would be a slave with him. The slave's only job was to say, memento mori, memento mori. Remember that you're going to die. It was to keep him from thinking that he was a demigod because of all the people who were applauding him because he had good ratings. And kings are mortals. And we need people who are going to stand up to our modern day kings and remind them who they really are. Who will say, who do you think you are to roll dice with the world like this? You are just a man. They're always men. You are just a man. And the greatness of men or women, despite the lies of a world that extols murderers, consists entirely in their capacity to magnify the name of the Lord. We need people who will say to kings, hands pulled you screaming and helpless from your mother's womb not so long ago, and in not so long the casket's going to be closed over your face and light will be gone from you forever, and unless the Lord chooses to shine light perpetual upon you, you will dwell in darkness forever. So who do you think you are to blaspheme and trespass on the authority that has been loaned to you by the Almighty for a season? Who do you think you are? We need prophets to speak to kings because kings are leading us into judgment. And the truest vision of biblical judgment is God withholding restraint from a people who keep asking for something that's awful for them. Let us have it, let us have it, let us have it. And judgment is when God stops protecting us from the consequence of our own actions. So we need prophets like Jonah.
Like the church, many churches today, he ran from his responsibility, but when he finally owned it, he wound up in Nineveh, a wicked city under God's judgment. God said, if they don't repent, they're going to be destroyed. And word reached the king, and this astonishing thing happened. The word filtered up to the king, and you know what happened? The king heard it, and immediately got off his throne. And he took off his royal robes, and he put on sackcloth, and he sat in the dust. And he initiated a fast. He remembered he was but a human person, and the nation was saved. Stranger things have happened. So let us speak in praise of naivete. A final coda, because our faith is proven in deeds. Repentance and fasting and prayer have to take concrete form. And that concrete form can be exactly what it seems. It can be fasting and prayer. We can repent of our indifference, we can fast from food, and we can pray zealously that our nations, that our world are going to be spared the actions that we seem to be hurtling toward. But we can sacrifice in other ways too. If you're in Canada, you should call your MP and you should tell them to tell the government to sign this treaty. That's something every Canadian can do. That's something every Canadian can make an election about. Because no elected official cares about the 18th priority on your list. But if you call enough, it makes a difference. If you're in the United States, or if you're an American, you should call your senator and House rep and ask them to co-sponsor the bill that would prevent a nuclear first use by the president. You should also urge them to maintain the Iran deal. We can fast in concrete ways. We can fast by giving. In Canada, the Project Plowshares is the independent peacemaking arm of the Canadian Council of Churches. They don't give me any money, so I can, without apology, say that you should give them some of yours. In the United States, the Plowshares Fund and the Global Security Institute are two organizations I believe in that I think are doing good work. I receive money from neither. We live in the time of God's mercy. That's the thing. So we better make use of it. This world is imperfect. It's often awful. It's terrible, but there's still time until there's not. Until God's done with us. But he's not done with us yet, and that's grace. In our rite of Compline, before we lay ourselves down to rest, the priest absolves sins and pronounces a blessing that includes the prayer that we would have time for the amendment of life. May the Lord grant us that time, undeserving as we are. May we use it faithfully. O Lord, hear our prayer, and let our cry come unto thee.
Well, I'm a little concerned that people are going to start going down to Little Trinity to hear that preaching. Maybe you didn't steal my flock. That's okay. How impressive was that? What a beautiful, powerful presentation. So everybody online, we see you and thank you for being here with us. Time for some question and answer. Who's got a question for Reverend Tyler?
You posted some stats on how many ballistic missiles for various countries, etc. I wonder how, I really don't understand what kind of damage each of those units can do. So I wonder how relevant it is to look at those individual things or look at how many when any one of them could perhaps affect everybody.
I want to make sure I'm understanding your question right. Can you give me one more sentence just so I know how to speak to what you're saying?
I guess I just feel a little bit that I really don't understand that piece of it at all, and I wonder if I even need to. I guess I'm asking you to clarify what an individual ballistic missile unit can do in terms of destruction? If you, I know it's not a technical talk, but
Fair so I can answer that generally. Back when I was more versed in the technical stuff, I could have given you a more satisfactory answer. I mean, one nuclear weapon can't destroy the whole world.
Can it drift though? I mean, can
Yeah, so what a nuclear weapon does, I probably should have led with this. What a nuclear weapon does is it causes an explosive chain reaction in what's called fissile material. That's either uranium or plutonium. There's basically two ways of making a nuclear weapon. One is to fire a bullet of fissile material into a solid mass of fissile material, and the other is to create an explosion that makes fissile material hyper compressed. Those two ways cause a reaction in which the energy in the matter is released. Depending on the size of the bomb and how the warhead and how effective it is, how well it's made, so how much of the potential energy of the mass is used in an explosive way, drives how destructive it is. So the weapons that were used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki are the size of the detonating device on modern nuclear weapons. That said, the most explosive, or the most powerful nuclear weapons ever developed are not in anybody's arsenal today. The Soviet Union did it, the Tsar Bomba test. I forget the year. John?
1961.
Thank you. 1961. Checks in way. The blast radius was recorded going around the world 5 times. Like, it was detectable going around the world. It shattered windows 200 miles away. But that's not most nuclear weapons today. So most nuclear weapons today are going to be somewhere between Hiroshima and Tsar Bomba, and there are places where you can go online. I think it's you could Google bomb maps, and they will show you the yield. But you're looking at, say, roughly of a half-mile to a quarter-mile radius of almost complete fatality, say with an average-sized nuclear weapon.
But with some lasting resonance.
So then so the first thing that goes is heat, and then a blast radius that destroys everything, and then there's of course radiation in everything, which is what poisons things. Now, radiation in the air dissipates pretty quickly, but if the radiation, which is why when a bomb explodes high in the air, the radiation effects are not as long term. But if a bomb explodes close to the ground, it irradiates the material and shoots it up into the mushroom cloud, and then that can spread. And that can spread to, I mean, it's not like the blob, it's not going to kill everyone who comes into contact with it. There are varying degrees of radiation exposure and ways of how much you're going to be exposed or not. But I guess what I'm dancing on is that there's no simple way to answer your question, because the yield of modern nuclear weapons is variable. A lot of them you can even dial it on the warhead to change it for a different circumstance. But yes, what you are concerned about is an explosive radius of blast and heat that is far more than any conventional weapon ever built. And the uncontrollable effects of radiation, which vary greatly depending on what the bomb irradiates in exploding and wind patterns. So once you have a lot of nuclear weapons used, then you potentially have a lot of irradiated material that are casting a pretty significant fallout zone. I think nuclear weapons are irretrievably wicked, but I also want to be realistic about them. People wondered if anything would ever grow again in Hiroshima. It's a thriving city today. It's not radioactive to visit Hiroshima right now. So they're not, I think there's a certain dose of realism is not sort of seeing them as, one bomb is the apocalypse.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Tyler, as you know, your passion converts us all.
You talked about call up MPs to sign the treaty to ban the nuclear weapons, and maybe I wasn't listening carefully. Who originated the ban? When was it signed, and how many have signed? Spend a half a minute exploring that, what on earth the ban on nuclear weapons is.
The ban treaty was negotiated in the early part of the first part of this year, 2017. It was negotiated in the United Nations by the countries that elected to be part of those negotiations. I do not have the exact number of how many participated in those negotiations. The text of the treaty was completed on July 7th, and it was open for signatures and ratification in September. We have someone here who could answer this much better than I can. No pun intended, I can. Also, that's why they named it that. Okay. They learned something new, folks. I don't know if is there anything you want to fill out on that, Phyllis?
122 nations adopted the treaty. And that's significant. And it came to pass because there were determined citizens all around the world who said, we've had it. We've had it and we're not going to take it any longer. The big boys say we need their toys, they need their toys, and we say no. And we say no because we understand with our hearts how utterly cruel and wicked nuclear weapons were the people of Hiroshima, to which I've been into Nagasaki twice. And now 53 nations have signed it, but only 3 have ratified it. And it's up to us to do the work that will see those weapons on the way to being banned, on the way to being eliminated after being banned. And Mr. Trudeau's argument is based on the notion that you have to ban, that you have to get rid of them. Fine, but first you must ban them, and that's how we got rid of landmines. And maybe I'll speak later.
Thank you, Phyllis. I would add, the request for Canada to sign the treaty is not an innocuous one, because Canada is part of NATO, and NATO is a nuclear alliance. And so a lot of work would then be entailed with how do you square participation in NATO with this commitment to not be protected by nuclear weapons. So asking the government to sign the treaty is asking them to take on a whole heck of a lot of work, but the alternative is to do the work in advance. And what I think is the genius of the treaty is it's a runaround. What I was presenting is, I described the importance of the NPT. The NPT signatories will still point to it and say, this is the road to zero. We're going to, step by step within this. The counter argument is, you're not. You're not actually moving toward zero. It's that's not actually an avenue that leads where we want. And so what I think the genius of the ban treaty is that it creates a norm, an international norm, that then becomes a leverage point to work within nations, whether or not they are supportive of it. So, other questions?
You touched just a little bit earlier, really quickly, on testing that's been done, and it was mainly anthropogenic was what we were talking about indigenous, poor people, communities, children, men. Out of all of the testing that's been done, what would you guesstimate has been done in our oceans? Like, what percentage of it? We know most of it's been done in the oceans, of course. Every time people launch these things at 99, I don't know what the percentage is, and how much damage do you think our oceans have already taken just from the testing alone? Forget about whether we even get into any so-called conflict, because I think our oceans have been in conflict for a number of decades now, and I'm just wondering how much of an effect this has had. We all know about climate change and all that stuff, and I don't think the nuclear testing that's been going on is helping in any way.
So my candid answer is I have no idea.
We don't even really know, do we always know when people test these things? We don't even always know, do we really?
We do, yes, we do always know. There hasn't been, There hasn't been atmospheric testing. I don't remember when the last atmospheric test was.
Well, that's so obvious, so that's why they want to go in the oceans all the time. I mean,
Well, the preferred method is underground. So all of North Korea's testing has been underground. What is a threat that the foreign minister of North Korea has alluded to is they might do an atmospheric test above the Pacific Ocean, which would be a sight that we haven't seen in decades, and is alarming for that reason. In terms of the actual ecological damage of testing in oceans, you're asking the wrong guy. I'm sure there are people who have studied it, but I have no idea. I'm sorry, I can't answer the question.
it's so difficult to monitor, that's the problem. I mean, you can just imagine though, what you're talking about with the atmosphere, that's something that's so visual to us. But imagine just every time that we test one of these things under the oceans, or you could just imagine what's going on under there.
Yeah, thank you.
And it's so hard for us to monitor because we don't,
Thank you.
Can you speak briefly about the risks of an accidental nuclear exchange?
I can speak at length about it. I don't know if I can speak briefly. No, I can try. In terms of like pure percentages, it's really hard to say. The fact is that the U.S. and Russia maintain a launch on warning policy that's inherited from the Cold War. And the rationale for this policy is that a surprise attack could, if targeted at our ground-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, could remove a country's ability to retaliate. And so the operating procedure has been that on warning of an attack, that we will launch our missiles so that they can't be detonated in the ground, and so that's the posture. So at any given time, there's roughly a 30-minute window hanging over the world in which the missiles could be in the air right now because of a computer error or what, and we wouldn't know. That takes about 15 minutes to cross the world. The U.S. and Russia are really the only ones to worry about in this regard. I mean, France and the UK maintain an active launch posture as well, but they have submarines which are much more protected. Nuclear submarines are basically invincible. I mean, for all intents and purposes. There have been a number of accidents throughout the history of the U.S. and the Soviet Union and then Russia. We lost this year a man named Stanislav Petrov, who in the early 80s was a launch officer in the Soviet forces, who got the alert that the U.S. had launched nuclear weapons at the Soviet Union. And if he had passed on that command or that data, it would have certainly resulted in the order to launch back. And he didn't. He just elected not to because he thought this can't be real. And he was the subject of a documentary called The Man Who Saved the World. And there's something to that. Bill Perry, the former Secretary of Defense from the United States, vividly tells the story of being woken up at 3 in the morning by a launch officer who said, "My computer is showing 200 Soviet missiles coming at the United States right now." Talk about burying the lead, because then he said, "But it's a computer error." Like, you could start with that. What I'm about to tell you is a computer. Anyway, what he had realized was that someone, the previous shift, had left the training tapes in, as opposed to the whatever tapes.
Reality tapes.
Yeah, and so as a result, but he was savvy enough to sort of look at the situation and realize. But there have been a number of times when we have come to the brink of the system being tested, and only been protected by humans. There have been mistakes. A flock of geese has been mistaken by radar as the rising of the moon. Thanks, Canada. As nuclear weapons. The rising of the moon has been detected as a nuclear launch. So there are all sorts of instances of accidental exchange, and unfortunately the command and control postures that would correct that would give some decision-making time, have not been implemented.
Hi, Todd.
Hi.
Can you comment on a country's use of nuclear energy and the relationship to future development of nuclear weapons? I don't know if there is a relationship there. Thank you.
There doesn't have to be, but there can be. So I'm, like I said, really not, like in so many ways, not a nuclear scientist, but the same technology that's used to produce, to enrich nuclear material, like you can find uranium in the ground, right? But it's not actually good for nuclear purposes unless you enrich it so that the radioactive isotope occupies a certain percentage of the material. At a certain percentage, it's good for producing nuclear energy. At a very high percentage of enrichment, it's usable for producing nuclear weapons. Plutonium is usable at all levels for producing nuclear weapons. So Japan, which has a lot of plutonium, could be a nuclear weapons state within months if they chose. And that might be like a long estimate. They've got the wherewithal to produce it if they want. So a good deal of this goes on people's sort of evaluation of nations' conduct and their sense of they're acting, they're not trying for this, but there are probably 20 odd countries around the world that are what are called potential nuclear weapons states that have the capacity to break out in a very short order if they so chose. This is what was alarming to people about Iran's behavior, that they had a nuclear energy program, which by treaty right they're perfectly entitled to, but they weren't behaving the way that you would think good faith members of the treaty would behave, and so their motives were a bit muddy. Does that address your question?
You said that indigenous people around the world have borne the brunt of much of the nuclear testing. Could you say more about that?
So this is one of the things that has come out of the humanitarian impact discourse, that it has looked at the legacy of testing and who's been subject to that. And perhaps unsurprisingly, nuclear weapons testing is the ultimate sort of NIMBY issue, right? Nobody wants it in their backyard. And so countries that have done it to the people who are least able to protest it. So at the conference in Vienna, which I attended, it was notable, and the most meaningful moment of the conference, in my view, was a panel discussion of a woman from Australian Aboriginal communities, a woman from the Marshall Islands, and then a Mormon woman from Utah. It's not indigenous, but who all talked about the ways in which their communities have been devastated by the legacy of testing, and the impact on reproduction and on childbearing and on the capacity of the earth to carry crops is perhaps the most devastating. So this is not, again, I'm giving a bit of an extension to it because the Utah population was not indigenous, but they were poor and they were religious minorities. And the U.S. government quite consciously decided not to test when the wind was blowing south toward Vegas, and yes to test when the wind was blowing east toward Mormon cow farmers. And the radiation that's in a nuclear fallout is cesium, is especially susceptible to going into the ground in the form of water and rain. It comes up in grass. The cows eat the grass. It's hyper-concentrated in the milk, and you get entire communities where nobody doesn't get cancer. Everybody gets cancer. In the Marshall Islands, the particularly devastating consequence on that community, which is definitely an indigenous community, was the development of what were called jellyfish babies, where women started, I'm quoting here, delivering babies that looked like bunches of grapes that were born without bones, and which died within a day or two of being born. I think similar phenomena when she said that, the woman from Utah and the woman from Australia nodded. That particular aspect of it is of the humanitarian discourse is not something that I have any substantive personal knowledge of, but something that I have observed of it. So I can't go into greater depth than that, but that's at least a gesture toward. And I know that the prioritization of Indigenous communities has been front and center in the humanitarian discourse and in the BAM treaty negotiations in a way that it just does not happen in the rest of the nuclear security apparatus. I've never seen a panel that was all women and mostly Indigenous. It just doesn't happen.
Thank you so much. I know there's more questions. I'm sorry, but we are at time, and we do have staff here that need to wrap up, including myself. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and it's been such a delight to be together and get to exchange ideas and to hear more about and learn about and think about what would it mean to be people of peace and to take up the prophetic call that Tyler charges all with. So I know I learned so much tonight, and I'm so thankful to you. And side note, I'm a printmaker in my side life. And I went upstairs and I said, oh, I need to have a print to give Tyler to thank him for his talk. So I went through my box of leftovers. And I found one of my prints, and I said, oh, I'll give him this one. And it says Memento Mori on it, which that was really interesting. So thank you, for reminding us all that we are dust, and to dust we return, and that it is our charge to honor the sacredness of life and to protect that. So thank you for your time. You're welcome to join us on Sunday, of course. 8, 9, and 11, and 4:30 are our services at St. James Cathedral. And next Tuesday, the 14th, for Bishop Mark McDonald. And what do we have on Saturday? Oh yes, of course. We have a lot of things going on here. And you're welcome to all of it. Blessings. Get home safe.